As noon was approaching, Richie began to get hungry. His parents had gone out shopping earlier that Saturday morning, and they'd promised that they would bring him lunch, but as the clock ticked towards 12 and his stomach began to grumble, Richie began to doubt whether or not his parents would follow through on what they had promised. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Now, Richie's not an especially gifted cook. He decided to make something simple like pizza on toast, but when he did so, it didn't go so well. First, he dropped the tomato sauce and the glass shattered all over the floor, making a huge mess and using up the sauce that he was going to use, so now he had to use ketchup instead, not the same. And then he put the stuff in the toaster oven and got distracted when he should have been pulling it out, and it got burned. And so now he had to muscle down this disgusting tasting overcooked lunch. And as he did, and he saw the mess he was going to have to clean up, he contemplated whether or not it was worth it. And no sooner had he done that than his parents arrived with takeout pizza from his favorite restaurant. Richie went to all that trouble when he could have just trusted his parents to do as they said they would, and he would have gotten all the pizza he wanted with a whole lot less mess. Now, hopefully, Richie learned his lesson from this exchange that his mom and dad were trustworthy, trying to do what he couldn't do for himself rather than trusting them to do as they said they would do just created a mess. And as we continue looking at the life of Abraham, we find that he needed to learn the same lesson as well. When we looked at the story last week, we saw that Abraham showed remarkable faith by following God's command to relocate himself and his family to the land of Canaan. Go, Abraham! But in the story that follows, Abraham loses his nerve and makes a mess trying to get what God had already promised him. Read with me in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, take your wife, take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything that he had. Now, when it comes down to it, Abraham's misadventure in Egypt happens because he doesn't trust God to look after him. Now, Abraham did get riches out of it, including a slave who will cause some complications later on in the story. But in agreeing to bless Abraham, God was agreeing to supply him with what he needed anyways. All Abraham managed to accomplish was getting deported from Egypt and straining his relationship with Sarah. I'll call her Sarah instead of Sarai, even though the text says that, just because it's too confusing, because her name will be changed later on. So in the end, he got what would have come to him, but with a lot more heartache than it required. And like Abraham, we also are called to a way of faith, to follow God and trust in his blessing. And like Abraham, we may also be tempted to take matters into our own hands rather than entrusting ourselves to God. Like Abraham, we must learn this difficult truth. When we follow God in faith, we can depend on him and must not fall for the temptation of disobeying him to get the things that we've already been promised. We must respond to our situation. If we respond to our situation in fear rather than faith, like Abraham, we'll have an unnecessary mess in our lives. Now, in the previous story, God had promised to bless Abraham if he went to the land of Canaan. But it seems like he hasn't been in the land very long when a famine arrives. And Abraham is afraid, and his faith falters. Now, we shouldn't be too hard on Abraham. This is a difficult situation. He's left his extended family behind, and had he been in his land with his own people, he might have pooled resources with them and distributed the sacrifice. But here, it's just Abraham, Sarah, and his nephew Lot, and a couple of servants. While this text doesn't give us the reason for the famine, we do know that this would not have come as a surprise to God. So what seems to be happening is that God leads Abraham to a place where a famine is about to happen. And if Abraham can trust that God will provide for him, then God can show Abraham he's dependable in a tough spot. But rather than seeking guidance from God, Abraham takes matters into his own hands, heading to Egypt. As he's about to enter Egypt, Abraham tells Sarah not to tell anyone they're married. Sarah must be quite a beauty, because Abraham is worried that when the men of Egypt see her, they will be so driven mad with desire that they'll kill Abraham to take her for themselves. So I guess she's quite a looker. I imagine that if I ever tried that with Carolyn, she would have absolutely none of it. But in Abraham's culture, she's considered her husband's property, and so she has no choice but to go along with his harebrained idea. Abraham and Sarah are half-siblings, but the demand that she tell people that she is his sister is a deliberately misleading half-truth. The fact that they are half-siblings is scarcely more relevant than the fact that they are man and wife. Icky from our perspective, but maybe less from theirs. Anyway, Abraham has an obligation to protect his wife, but instead he's putting her in a difficult spot to protect himself. It seems that Abraham projects his own shortcomings onto God. Abraham has entered into a relationship with God where God has become his protector. And this mirrors the kind of relationship that Abraham is supposed to have with his own wife. As her husband, he's honor-bound to protect her. But Abraham betrays Sarah when he's supposed to protect her. And evidently he feels compelled to do so because he believes that he can't trust God to do for him what he promised. His lack of faith doesn't just harm him, it arguably harms Sarah a lot more. He basically pimps her out for financial gain. Now, in the ancient world, older brothers would negotiate marriage proposals for their sisters. So Abraham basically offers up his wife to Pharaoh, who will give him great wealth in exchange for rights to his sister. Abraham seems to make out pretty well in the exchange, getting livestock and slaves. It says servants in the text, but these people are property. Of course, Sarah isn't the only victim here. God, of course, sends diseases on Pharaoh and his household. Pharaoh thought that this was an available woman, and he snapped her up for his harem. Now, of course, polygamy was never God's original intent, but it was widely accepted in the ancient world, especially for royalty. Pharaoh even pays for Sarah with the livestock and the slaves given to Abraham. So Pharaoh somehow figures out what's going on and sends Abraham and Sarah away and lets them keep the bride price. So to summarize the story, Abraham, having gone to Canaan by faith, loses his nerve when famine hits the land and he heads to Egypt, demonstrating a lack of faith in God's provision. When he's entering Egypt, he fears that powerful people will kill him so that they can take his wife for themselves, demonstrating a lack of faith in God's protection. But despite Abraham's failures, God honors his promise to look after Abraham, delivering both him and Sarah from Egypt, and even setting them up with great wealth. As Paul so beautifully puts it, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. While the particulars of what happened to Abraham and Sarah are quite foreign to us, the underlying temptations are actually familiar. We also may be tempted by fear to doubt God's provision and protection. We may be tempted to try to do for ourselves what only God can do for us, and in the process, we only make a mess. But we have the opportunity to learn from Abraham's failures. And even if we fail, we find that God is faithful to us. So, trusting in God's provision. When the early church first started, It was drawn from among the poorest people of a colonized nation. Jesus gives them a huge job to do, make disciples of all nations. Surely with such an ambitious project, God should, give this project to people who are better resourced. But God promises to look after his people, to supply them. As Jesus tells us, when we seek God's kingdom, meaning his will in our lives, then he will make sure that we are looked after. In Matthew 6:31-33, he says, "Do not worry, saying, 'What will we eat? Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear?' For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." I should point out, though, that the promise to supply his people is not meant as an invitation to self-indulgence. Consider it sort of like an expense account. If I were a salesman of luxury goods, there might be times where I spend money on myself as part of what I'm doing. I need significant funds because I need to wine and dine clients or prospective customers. I also probably have to spend a lot of money on clothing because if I'm going to hobnob with that kind of people, then I probably need to fit in. But there are limits. I can't, for example, take my extended family on a Caribbean cruise because that's not actually contributing to the bottom line of the company. Well, God's promise to look after us is kind of similar to this. It's contingent on us seeking his agenda. It's not a way of achieving our agenda. In other words, when our highest concern is his kingdom, he looks after us. But when my highest concern is my kingdom, God supplying me with whatever I ask for works against what he's trying to do, so I can't expect God to cater to my every whim. But I can trust God to give me what I need so that I can be obedient to him. Trusting God's protection. Just as Abraham was worried that God wouldn't protect him from the Egyptians, we often worry that God won't protect us either. But God does promise to protect us. Consider what the psalmist says in Psalm 91, 9-11. "If you say, 'The Lord is my refuge,' and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you. No disaster will come near your tent, for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." God has taken us on as his people, like a patron in an ancient culture. And as a patron, he's responsible for our safety. But many Christians today doubt God's faithfulness to his promise of protection. We see, for example, the waning of the church culture over the last 60 years. And we worry, is this a sign that God is abandoning us? Or we fear being taken advantage of by those who aren't sympathetic to our faith. And so we justify hostility towards them, even though Jesus explicitly tells us to love our enemies. God's promise to protect us is dependable, but it needs to be understood in a broader context. Now, the more attentive of you may have picked up on the fact that from the psalm that I just read, the final verse was actually the verse quoted by Satan when he was tempting Jesus to jump off the temple. Satan is tempting Jesus to try to force God's hand of protection so that he can immediately be seen as the Messiah by the Jewish religious authorities. It's a temptation to shortcut God's plan for how Jesus will become king. Satan is offering a kingdom without a cross. Jesus refuses because he understands that God is faithful to protect him from pointless suffering. But God does ask him to suffer out of love for others to bring about their redemption. Now we see this at play. Throughout Jesus' ministry, God protects him. So there's a story, for example, in Luke chapter 4, where a crowd is so offended by Jesus that they try to kill him, and it says that he just passes through the crowd. You see, that attack on Jesus wasn't consistent with God's plan of redemption, and so God faithfully defended Jesus. But when God's redemptive plan required Jesus' suffering sacrifice, Jesus submitted to it. See, for example, John 12, 27-28, and Matthew 26, 38-42. And as with Jesus, so with us. God is faithful to protect us from pointless suffering. But he asks us to follow Jesus' example in submitting to suffering that plays a part in his grand plan of redemption. We may go through things that feel senseless at the time. We see, for example, children getting abused, faithful people who nonetheless suffer mental health challenges or physical infirmities, or people being the victims of crimes. But I believe that God only allows these things to happen when they can be used for his redemptive possibility, or for his redemptive purposes. Personally, I've wrestled with this question about why God allowed my father to die when he was just 33 years old. What did that accomplish? Only God can know for sure. But our suffering can do a number of things. It can help us to learn to hope in God rather than in the perishable things of this world. It can give us an opportunity to display peace in hard times so others see God's power at work in us. It can give us an opportunity to show others God's radical forgiveness so that they can believe that God can forgive them too. On this side of eternity, we won't know the precise reasons why some individual misfortune happened to us, but we can trust that God won't let it happen for no reason. As God provides and protects, hopefully we can stand in faith. But when we don't, when we shrink from the challenge as Abraham did, we can know that God remains faithful. As we said above, there were consequences for Abraham's lack of faith. It harmed both Sarah and Pharaoh's household. But God still honored his commitment to bless and protect Abraham. God calls us to stand in faith. In all likelihood, there are going to be times where our faith fails. And just as with Abraham, God is patient with us in our failures. There will be more opportunities for us to learn how to trust him. At the same time, that's not to say that we can afford nonchalance when God is challenging our faith. When my faith buckles, I don't lose my place as a member of God's people, but I still may experience consequences, as may the people that I love. And I may find that I get sidelined in God's great plan. His kingdom is going to come, but it may be that he chooses active roles for people who have learned to trust him in difficult times and sidelines the people who don't. So to summarize, in the story, Abraham serves as a cautionary tale and an encouragement. Abraham's failure reminds us not to doubt that God can provide for us, even if we need to understand that provision means God will give us what we need to do the job he's given us, not as a blank check to satisfy our every desire. Abraham's failure reminds us not to doubt that God can protect us. But we need to understand that God doesn't protect us from all unpleasant things. He does protect us from suffering that doesn't bring about the possibility of redemption, but he does ask us to submit to suffering that has redemptive possibility. Finally, Abraham's failure reminds us that even when we are faithless, God remains faithful. That doesn't mean that we should consider obedience optional. The consequences for failure are very real, yet it means that when we have failed, we can hold on to our hope, knowing that God does not reject us when we fall short. God is calling each of us to our own Canaan, a place of uncertainty where our faith will be tested. But we need not be fearful because he is faithful.